Good to have you here today. David, Weiss was our speaker this morning and presented a really thought-provoking presentation for us. And I loved the expectation or the scenario that you painted that we'd all have this time this afternoon to be thinking, oh, we should have asked this question, or you also confessed to saying that perhaps you would even think of things that you had failed to mention. I think maybe that would be a great place to jump in and say, was there anything that you had hoped you had mentioned this morning that you wanted to follow up with? I can help moderate some questions. Feel free to use the chat, folks, and you can put stuff in there, and I'll monitor that to make sure that those questions get addressed at some point. But also, we're not so large that we can't handle a little bit of informality and just sort of chiming in if you would like to pose a question or respond to a discussion point here. And we'll take it from there. So, David, you want to just enlighten us to see if there was more to the story that you wanted to share or reemphasize for us tonight?
Sure. I think the one thing that I heard in a comment from one of the parishioners afterwards, I'm not sure if she's on tonight or not, was a woman who said to me that she appreciated everything that I had to say. She liked a lot of it, but that she really got caught on my call for lament and say, lament is just a hard thing to invite people to. And there's truth to that. And it reminded me the very first public talk I gave on faith and climate, which was, I think, 2017 over in a Lutheran church in Eau Claire. They had invited me to do a 3-part series. And so this is where I initially developed the idea of becoming an apocalyptic, evangelical, prophetic community of faith. And my first lecture was on apocalyptic. And I used the phrase in my title that's something to the effect that to become an apocalyptic church is to call people into lament. And the sponsoring folks at the church rewrote that because they were afraid that if they used lament in their publicity, that people would be turned off and not come to it. And they said to me, you're welcome to speak about lament if you want to. We just don't want to use it in the publicity because we don't think people will come through the door. And so when this woman mentioned that to me this morning, I recognized that there is sort of a PR issue with inviting people into lament. But I think what I would expand on a little bit is that it's part of the biblical tradition, but in Joanna Macy's book, Act of Hope, she really suggests that lament is almost like the secret passageway by which we reach our superpower as human beings, which is our capacity for empathy. And that it is only when, and she talks about lament as being what happens when we allow ourselves to feel the suffering of the planet around us. So it's not us feeling sorry for ourselves. It's us feeling sorry for what is happening to the planet in many ways because of our actions. But it's not simply sadness, because it's the recognition that when I am finding myself swallowed by sadness, by lament, it is the measure of my forgotten kinship with creation around me. And so that somehow that lament, it softens our souls to the point that we recognize that the anguish that we're feeling is bearing witness to a kinship with creation that we have largely forgotten. We have sort of this anthropology which says that we're at the very top of the pyramid, and lament is a way to remind us that we're part of the web and that the web is being torn asunder. So I think I could have explained that a little bit better this morning, but that's what I mean when I talk about lament. It really is the secret passageway to a superpower. And then you begin to understand the nefariousness of a society that bends over backwards to make sure that we never, ever go deeply into lament, lest we touch the power that may allow us to resist.
Wow, that's powerful.
So
That struck a chord for me, David. Several, and as an undergraduate, my congregation knows this. I went to business school, and previously was in business world before becoming a pastor. But that introduction to marketing, marketing 101, the one of the lessons I remember, vividly was, the power of imagery and communicating a message. And you all remember an ad campaign in the 70s, because I remember it as a child, speaking to the need to address pollution, right? And water quality and air quality. And it was an image, or the image, the graphic image, was an indigenous actor looking out at the landscape with a single tear, coming down his face. This is the power of a lament to enable people to access an emotional response to something that's happening in their midst. And so that's that quick example comes to mind for me in that sense. So what other questions might we have for David today? And Paul, quick with your hand, you get the first one out of the chute.
David, this is Paul Sponheim. I heard you with the Process and Faith group. So this is my second chance. Yeah, your analysis is brilliant and convincing. The proposals, the second half, the 15 minutes is much more challenging. It seems like an uneven mix. There's more peril than promise. The systemic character of the problem was made clear, but we seem to be appealing to individuals to have a change of heart, to understand, to tell the truth, to face up to finitude. Is there a structural response? Now, you mentioned the church. You made me think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer back in the 40s. He talked about a church in a world come of age, and he said all of our ceremonies will be different. I wonder if you've seen any analogy. He wasn't dealing with climate change, but he was dealing with a world come of age.
right. Yeah, that's a really provocative question, because it does seem to me that as a church today, that on one hand, I do think we need to invest energy in shaping the people who venture inside our walls, and yet the peculiar charism of the church in this particular age may be to be what Bonhoeffer spoke of. He spoke of Jesus as the person for others. And so it may be that the church's primary task today is to be a community for others, even as we are a community that is deeply invested in shaping who we are. I'm struck, but I agree with you, Paul, that there is more peril than promise right now. And I wrestle with that a lot. One of the things that people often mention in the circles of folks that I read, and it's an example that Joanna Macy uses in Act of Hope, is that even when peril seems great, that there's all kinds of historical examples of promise sort of blossoming out of nowhere. And an example that is often given is that, several years ago, it seemed like we were in peril of having an amendment passed in the state of Minnesota that was going to ban same-sex marriage. And in the midst of that peril, the very resistance to it not only stopped the peril, but became a promise that moved forward. Now, so I'm very aware, and you think of the collapse of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there's a sea shift that happens and we never saw it coming. The caution that I feel towards invoking those types of examples today is that all of those examples were unexpected shifts in terrain that was primarily the human psyche. It was people's hearts and minds being shifted. And what I think is qualitatively different about climate and the whole ecological crisis is that mathematics and physics has a seat at the table too. And mathematics and physics isn't altered by our best intentions. The people who directed the same-sex marriage campaign would say, we did it by storytelling because we knew that if we told the right stories, that the opposition would no longer be the opposition because their hearts would be softened. And so I do think, somebody had asked this morning, how do we reach people on the other side? I think learning to use stories becomes perhaps a way that we reach the people on the other side, but stories are not going to persuade the way that math and physics works out. And so there are things that we have loaded into the climate system, ways that we have stressed the earth systems that telling stories isn't going to shift. And
Have you happened to read Miguel de la Torre, Abandoning Hope?
I have not. I have got a book. I'm not sure if it's that book by him, but I have a book by him that is about hopelessness or abandoning hope.
Yes.
I've not read it.
I have, and his argument is that hope tends to postpone action. It doesn't yield creative, transformative action. There's always something we can hope for. Maybe the Berlin Wall will come down. It would be something of that nature. So when we don't really need to do that much.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So I'm familiar with that notion anyways, because in some of the circles that I do read, which are very climate oriented, they speak of hopium as, like in place of opium, that there are a lot of people who are imbibing in hopium because it makes them feel better, as though this is going to work itself out, and they're not at all convinced that that's going to happen.
He recommends only two things. It's a very short list. He recommends messing with the system. You just mess with the system. In an immigration hearing, you get up and read the Constitution out loud or something. It's not appropriate. You don't have the floor, but you're talking. The second is be with the poor. That's all he's got.
Yeah.
So he's got plenty of the truth telling, the apocalyptic. He's got that in spades, but not so much on the prophetic.
Ann Haugen, are you raising your hand as you have a question?
Yes, I am. It's not a question as much as a comment. With this huge problem, ecological problem, I think that there is a little bit of hope with the religious community. Quite a few years ago, I went up to the Ark at Cambridge for a retreat, and we had the theme up there is live simply so that others may simply live. And we've got a huge religious community in our world. And if all the churches and synagogues and Muslim people, Buddhists, Hindu would get together and live simply, there's a lot of hope that we could overcome or keep.
Yeah, I want to, I guess, emphasize and echo that, because it does seem to me now, Paul, you mentioned earlier, I do make an appeal to individuals, and I make an appeal in some ways to church communities. And it is the case that there are whole pieces of the ecological crisis that will probably only be addressed by governmental entities, that a church doing something different isn't going to make an impact. It's not going to make an impact above it, but it can make a huge impact below it. And Anne, you reminded me, it was just a short period of time, less than a week, several years ago, out at Holden Village in Washington. And the thing that really struck me there is that I have become increasingly conversant in recognizing systemic injustice. What I experienced at Holden Village was something akin to systemic justice or systemic grace. And my guess is that the same is true at the Ark, in that, part of systemic injustice is that I become basically a bystander, and there's virtually nothing that I can do to challenge it because it swallows me all the time. And what I experienced at Holden Village, in the way that they had composting set up in the dining hall and recycling set up, and they had all of these sort of checks and balances built into that community, such that you really needed to swim against the current to mess up, because the current was designed to carry you in the direction of simplicity, in the direction of just relationship. And this is where it seems to me, and I certainly don't have all the answers for this, but it seems to me that faith communities do have more capacity than we typically give ourselves credit for building within ourselves systems that reinforce justice in a gracious way, and they wind up pulling the rest of us along with it.
One of the things I wanted to ask Paul, if we've been thinking about doing a Bonhoeffer book, not only after today's session, but after the last couple one too, on the Christian nationalism. What would Bonhoeffer have to teach us living in a time like this? Paul, do you have any suggestions on which book would be a good one to read for us?
That's kind of tricky because the books are so different from each other. You could read Cost of Discipleship. That remains a very valuable book. I think the Letters and Papers from Prison, that's Bonhoeffer standing on the edge, written in the last months of his life. You could read the book that he wrote about the community he organized.
Life Together.
Life Together, yeah. So I would take one of those three, I think. Cost of Discipleship, Life Together, or the Letters and Papers from Prison.
Okay.
Yeah. Carol.
Yeah, this afternoon, this morning, David you, Peter, this morning, in your sermon happened to mention the social statements. And I thought, I know the church has written one on creation, climate, So I went online and read the statement on God's creation, and it was done in 1993. And I was wondering if I thought it was going to be out of date when I read it. And it's 12 pages. It's very thorough, and I think it still does a pretty good job. And it's something that maybe we should look at. It talks about the seriousness of the problem, but also all the things that enter into it: politics, economics, all of the systemic stuff, and the responsibility of individuals, but also what we can do as communities. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, in some ways, it's using more general terms, but it's worth taking a look at, I think. And I don't know, 1993, it seems like at some of our conferences on the synod level or national level or whatever, you think, is there stuff going on there where the church is asking again for a unified voice on doing some of this stuff? Because, like David just said, it has to be more of a government thing. Or I've heard that, what we end up throwing in the trash pile or even recycling is nothing compared to what it is on the industrial side or whatever. And, private enterprise has got to be making some choices here too and move fast. And, how do we put pressure on that? So.
Kirsten, were you trying to weigh in there?
So I was just going to say, in relation to the Bonhoeffer thing, John Matthews, who's actually a retired pastor in the Twin Cities, has written 2 books on Bonhoeffer. One is Anxious Souls Will Ask, and it explores the subtitle is The Christ-Centered Spirituality of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and it explores the little themes in Letters and Papers from Prison. World Come of Age is one of those themes that John explores there. There are 4 others, and I'm not going to try to remember them off the top of my head. I haven't looked at it in a few years. But if you decided to do Letters and Papers from Prison, doing that little book, which is like 80 pages, it's not very big, and then sort of browsing in the Letters and Papers from Prison, which is a pretty big collection, would be an option. That's all I wanted to say.
Paul, yeah.
I was just going to mention to Carol and the rest of us that some years ago, for the Lenten season, we did a series on the social statements of the church. And I don't know if they were recorded. There was preaching, there was teaching. So we could do it again using updated statements.
Yeah, the church has continues to go through the process of developing both social statements and social messages. Social statements are the statements that are developed in concert with the full expression of the church, including the laity, and those are voted on at assembly. Social messages are initiated and adopted within the Council of Bishops, and sort of tend to be a little bit more theologically limited in that arena. I don't mean to put that strong of a distinction there, but they don't carry quite the weight that the statements do, and the statements truly guide the political aspect of the ELCA. For example, when the presiding bishop writes a letter to the President of the United States advocating for a particular thing, it's usually because one of those social statements demands that is what we do as the church, that we advocate for this particular position, and that the presiding bishop of this church be of record with the leaders of this country on those particular topics. And so they're helpful teachings. The most recent one was the study, and we did this study at the church on women and justice. Ultimately, it was, I think, women, feminism, and justice ended up being the title of the statement, and that was a really dynamic process and got tremendous amount of feedback and buy-in, and it really touched on some really important stuff. There are threads that run throughout them. I quoted this morning from the very first of the three that were published, not about abortion, but the first one was essentially, how do we as a church engage the society in a civic way, and set the framework for how the church sees itself and interacts with the world around us. And so certainly when it comes to matters and opportunities for advocacy, it is really helpful to understand the frameworks that get developed in these social teachings of the church. And we give thanks for the just unbelievable effort it takes to pull something like those together, and to get consensus among 3.1 million members right today, right? So or something along those lines. There's a process, right? And I was struck as we were listening to David this morning, and towards the end there, this wondering, how do we as a church respond in this moment? And this is always something we ask. And I was struck sitting in our church building, which we are deeply connected to. And I quoted that there are 8,900 congregations of the ELCA, and how many of those 8,900s own and occupy real estate and facilities that all demand something of the world, that demands something of this planet that is so in peril. And we are not unusual in that we're wrestling with our facility. Our 65-year-old portions of our building are coming on 65 years old. We're wrestling with portions of that. We've got a roof that needs to be replaced. We're fighting with older, HVAC equipment. We're tending to, a space that isn't used the way that it was built to be used, occupied in different ways and in different volumes, and all of that. And these challenges are not unique to Prince of Peace, but they're in our face, and and we're dealing with them, and we're tending to them. And so it struck me that there are certainly churches that are trying to think differently about their relationship with their facility. And we were able to live more fully into the theological claim that the church is not the building, it's the people. For these last 2 years, COVID forced that on us, right? And what a gift that was to remember that reality, that we continue to be the church even though we are not gathered together in this particular facility. Now, today many of us were, but not all of us. And so anyway, so David, I'm curious, thoughts about the church, and yet how many churches truly identify and are deeply rooted in facility, and then the facility has that, carries with it that burden of its impact on this fragile environment that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Great question.
So I don't know that I have any great insight on that. It's a very real question. The church that I attend, which is St. Paul's United Church of Christ up on Summit Avenue, next week, I think it is, we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of having been burdened with this huge, beautiful church building, which when it was built 70 years ago, probably answered all of the prayers and aspirations that that community had were now a fraction of the membership of that community. And it was built, the building was built at a time that environmental sustainability was nowhere on the radar. So we wrestle with those questions as well. And I think you're exactly right that buildings are places that, they join us to the extractive systems in the world around us because they're heated with fossil fuel. They tie us to a system that is not doing the planet any good. And yet they are places where we gather to be moved and inspired to do good. And so there's a lot of ambiguity in that very dilemma. And if we freed ourselves of our building, would we be able to do as much as we can? Are there ways that we can make our buildings greener and make them maybe more multi-useful, so that there's less time that our buildings sit unused? And some of that, I know at St. Paul's UCC, some of that comes in through rental groups. I think we have 6 different AA groups that meet in our building, either before hours or after hours, because that's when those groups meet. And it's a way of us making sure that the building is better used rather than simply left empty. One thing it's not a direct response to your question, but it uses the word rooted, which you just used. I put in the chat the title of a book, Rooted and Rising. It's edited by 2 women. Leah Shade is one of them. I forget the name of the other, but it just came out within the last year. It's an anthology of Christian scientists, academics, and activists reflecting on faith and the climate crisis. They're all short autobiographical essays. And what I think is powerful about it, there might be 24 of them in the book. Each one is maybe 4 to 6 pages long, so very short pieces. And I would say more than half of them I would call top quality, and there are some that maybe missed the mark. But here's what struck me about it, is that there are voices in there of Christian scientists, academics, and activists who would be where I am with ecological crisis, that this is a predicament and I don't see any easy solution to it. And I don't want to criticize Christian theologians who are committed to a hopeful stance. It's not where I plant my flag, but I think we need their voices in the conversation as well. But I know that sometimes I can come across as having a very thin, wispy notion of hope. And these are voices that keep me company, because these are fellow Christians who are willing to say openly, I don't know that we're going to be able to turn this around. And so what does it mean to live with Christian faith in a moment that you don't know whether you can turn things around or not? And there are a couple people who are convinced that we can turn them around, because there's a short piece in there by Catherine Cahoe, who is a top tier climate scientist who is effusively hopeful, but there are voices in there that are stark voices. And even if that's not where you plant your flag, they are voices that really belong as part of the conversation. And however we move ourselves forward, we need to have as rich an array of voices in the conversation as possible. So.
But when you said the word 2030 today, this morning, about what that might look like, just in practical. Maybe this is more the lament part, but could you say again what you are thinking that it might look like?
Well, I don't have any idea. From the stuff that I have read, because I'm not a scientist, and so I read a lot of science as a layperson, and then I try to think about it as a theologian. But some of the things that I hear are that, and we're getting a glimpse of this between the pandemic and between the war in Ukraine, that we will see sort of a train wreck of global supply chains. That right now, I think it is that there are basically 5 global bread baskets of the world, where the vast majority of the world's food comes from 5 different places. And so far, we've been lucky because there hasn't been a major drought or a major flood in more than one of them at a time. And if 2 or 3 of those bread baskets were to go a couple seasons in a row, even just 2 seasons without being able to produce a full harvest, we would wind up with hunger on a global scale that we've never seen before, which today would translate into an immigration or refugee crisis, the scope of which we have never seen before, which will translate into animosity at the edge of our borders on a scale that we've never seen before, and possibly a resurgence of white nationalism like we have never seen before. And so part of this group, the Club of Rome, that did this limits to growth, and that was the chart that had the 2030 year marked out on it. There is a sense, even from people working on this today, that within the next decade or two, that we're going to see some set of dominoes that start dropping. And I don't know which dominoes will drop first, but part of it is that we have built a global system that is too big to fail, but there is no global bank that can bail out the global system if it starts to fail. You know, we bailed out some of the banks because they were too big to fail, but ecologically, we can't bail out planet Earth if planet Earth starts to fail. So if I were to say, like, what are my fears? My fears are...
What do you do with all the stuff in the Bible that kind of goes the other way, like the rainbow and the promise that, to humanity from God in the rainbow, and verses like rejoice in the Lord always, and again I will say rejoice, and all the times the Bible says to fear not. I appreciate a lot of what you're saying, but I'm kind of wonder how do you deal with all that stuff theologically?
I think theologically, especially the verses fear not or rejoice always may become verses that we need to lean into when it feels like there is fear all around us and that there's nothing to rejoice over. And the title of my talk this morning started out with leaning into the wind. And I do think that there are biblical texts that we may need to lean into. One of the things I noticed as I was getting ready to leave this morning is when you come in the doors of your church.
Micah 6, yeah.
Yes, Micah 6:8. And I made the comment to my wife as I was driving home that it's like, even if my outlook between now and 2030 or now and 2040 is extraordinarily bleak, there is no reason why I cannot get up every single day and say to myself, my task today is to do justice, pursue kindness, and walk in humility. Because those challenges, aspirations, that vocation remains my vocation regardless of what my outlook is. And it does seem to me that there are biblical texts about rejoicing always and fear not that become texts that are almost like tether lines when the tumult in the world threatens to bowl me over. I grab onto texts like that and onto texts like Micah 6:8 and say, I still have good work to do. I am still, as the pastor said in his sermon this morning, I am still the Lord of all, and I am still the servant to everyone. And so somehow that role of Christian liberty plays out no matter what. It's a matter of living with integrity and with evangelical zeal, no matter what happens.
Steve's fam, do you want to jump in there? And then Margaret, were you hoping to jump in as well?
I'll wait. Thank you.
Well, you go after Stephen.
I heard passing comment about the need for corporate changes, and I acknowledge that there are corporations that are talking more about a greener footprint or that sort of thing, and I appreciate that, but they still have the same consumption and status values that you talked about. And I think they're still building a consumptive and status society. And I think the church, and what I appreciate about our leadership right now in the church, is they're talking about values, 5 values. And I think what the church may be able to bring to the conversation is a discussion of values. And that perhaps that can be even in a very difficult or dreary outlook, that we can hang on to those values and try to proclaim values that will bring benefit to our world.
Yeah, I think that's really true. That I mentioned that this morning, that I hear more and more scientists who basically say we've gone as far as we can go with the science. And at this point, it really needs to be the shapers of value. And those are cultural players, those are religious players, those are artistic folks who are able to lead that conversation around values. And one of the things it gives me, I would say, an honest measure of hope is that part of the philosophy of nonviolence is grounded in the conviction, and this was true both for King and for Gandhi, that there is in each of us an echo of the sacred, and that nothing in life erases that echo of the sacred. It may bury it over with wound and trauma and all manner of stuff, but it doesn't erase it. It's as though God's claim on us is irrevocable, no matter how deeply buried it gets. And the philosophy of nonviolence is convinced that strategically played nonviolence has the capacity to blow on the embers of the sacred inside another person and bring them back to life. And it does seem to me that part of what scientists are saying is that we need people who can harness values, and maybe you harness them in the form of stories, but you harness values in a way that you can't reach corporations, but you can reach individuals within corporations, because those individuals are capable of being redeemed into a restored sense of what is right. So I'm going to defer to Margaret so that you have a chance to bring your voice in.
Well, I would love to jump off of what you were talking about, Stephen, and even I'm not sure if it was Gus or Peter who was speaking before about, that sense of hope, is that one of the things that David and I talk about, because he bounces a lot of these ideas off of me, is just that faith communities are in such a unique position in impending climate collapse, climate crisis, that you are linked together, arm in arm, value for value. You might not always see everything exactly the same way, but you are a natural community. We are a natural community of believers who can be ignited, who can be strengthened, who can be more resilient. And we have a responsibility to share that ability with others. And so how do we, in our own church communities and even across church communities, bring that strength together to be able to, respond, to be able to ignite action, to be able to bolster each other up, to be able to link those arms in a way that are just an endless chain of strength, as opposed to, getting buffeted, left and right by the winds of change. And that's what really that call for all of us as believers, I think, is about. It's about us together, and then taking us together sort of on the road. How do we then reach out into our neighborhoods, our own families, our communities, across communities, to really bring that sense of we have a role to play that is integral to a response that thrives, that we can thrive in and thrive on, even in the midst of crisis.
Go ahead, Paul.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
Okay. I love the way you're developing the theme of creation. We are created together and we have capacity. I have a book recommendation and a question. The book is Restoring the Kinship Worldview. This is a dialogue among Native Americans. They're not individualists in the way that most of us Caucasians are. So this is a 2022 publication by Darshan Narvez and some other writers. My question, David, I would be very interested in if you have some, leaning into the wind. It's a beautiful metaphor. What is it conveying? How does it work? The one idea that I've become familiar with is the notion of a field of force. Now that's a well-established scientific term. There aren't just atoms and neutrons. There are fields of energy. And that whatever happened to Jesus of Nazareth, the whole Jesus, his teaching, his healing, his dying on the cross, whatever happened 2 days later, there was a field of force that was generated, and it is powerful. It is building. Martin Luther King was part of that. It pulls people in, it moves people out. Have you got notions? Do you? John Cobb has built on that idea out at Claremont, the idea of a field of force. I wonder if you have read someone or come up with yourself with something that would, how does it work? How does the Spirit, Jesus says he's going to send the Spirit. How does that Spirit work?
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to accept that as my next assignment because I don't feel like I have an adequate answer I have, I think, lots of vague notions noodling around inside my head. And I'm going to focus on that. And you'll hear from me maybe in a month or two with something that I can actually stand behind. But I like this notion of kinship. I've listened to a number of talks by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who
Yeah.
talked about how in her native language, there is no it. Everything is in relationship to everything else.
Yeah, Brady Sweetgrass.
Yes, yep. And it does strike me that either this is a theme that it's less present in the Christian tradition, but I'm not convinced of that. I think it's more likely that the post-Constantinian Christian tradition found it a less useful part of it, and so it kind of set it to the side. But I would, rather than waste energy rambling today, I'd like to say, give me a little time to work on that, because it's a question worth more of an answer than I can give it tonight.
Thank you.
I was struck as you were laying out your seeds in the wind and your proposal for the church to see itself or to refashion itself or to organize itself around these apocalyptic, evangelical, prophetic mechanisms. I was struck by, as you were describing those, by how many places I could point within our existing, the church that we are today, and how we have tended to the callings that we have. We have the capacity, and we are these things now. This is not necessarily entirely aspirational. This is more recognizing the capacities that already exist. If these are truly the seeds that we need to now, grow and flourish, we have them, and certainly to maybe offer just a small response to Paul is that the Spirit is at work already in our midst, and we can point to these things as to how the Spirit is forming us. Steve, thank you for lifting up our work around values of late, and to me, there's a great embedded hopefulness coming from possibility and opportunity attached within this effort that hopefully will shape us going forward. So, it's not all doom and gloom. If we actually take stock of who we are and what we've been up to, and what in particular the Spirit has been up to in our midst, I think there are indicators that we can grab a hold of. So, Gus Haugen, are you waving and want to chime in here?
Yes, it's a while since I thought about this thing that I call world population problems, and 65 years ago, we were thinking rather differently. At that time, we thought there were plenty of resources in the world, but we had a distribution problem. They weren't distributed equally. And so some people had it and some people didn't have it. But now, hearing it this morning that, we've got a different problem. We've depleted some of our easy to reach resources, namely oil. And so things have really changed here in the last 65 years. And so we have to look at things rather differently now.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. That's exactly right. And part of what I tried to show with that little map exercise and the thinness of the piece of paper is that I think part of what has allowed us to paint ourselves into a very tight corner is that we don't have, and maybe we're not easily capable of, a clear sense of scale, because for everyone on this call, oil has been part of our life from the time that we were born and will be part of our life until the time that we die. And yet, if you were to go back just, even just a second thickness of that piece of paper, we would be 400 years ago, and oil wasn't shaping human life at that point. And so we have a real inability to grasp at a common sense level the scale of what's happening. And so it challenges us to figure out how can we overcome the common sense reality that makes it seem like, well, it was just yesterday and everything is fine, because it's not.
Yeah.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes. Michael Stetzler, I saw your finger.
My finger was there. David and Margaret, I'm sorry I missed your presentation this morning, so I'm not speaking from a base of understanding what all has gone before. But I would say this question of the Spirit and how the Spirit fills the world, and to what extent is some concept of the Spirit a force field that's a reality in our lives, to me is very important. And I think part of the problem that we struggle with, I struggle with, is that these are intellectual challenges for my ego, my consciousness, to try to grasp the physics of this, the environmental, science of it and so forth. But probably more important, it's hard for me to make room for the Spirit to inform me, because that's a different process entirely. So I would just encourage us as a community of faith to balance this, our struggle to take political and concrete outward action and discuss and learn and so forth with an effort to provide space for discernment and listening to the Holy Spirit individually and in congregation.
That's powerful.
Yeah, I think that's very, very significant, because I do believe that there are ways, and Peter, you talked about, that the number of ways that, even looking at your community, you say we're doing some of these things already. We're practicing these skills in this area. What if we were to bring that skill set over to this other area and see what would happen? And one of those skill sets is learning how to sit and listen and attend to the movement of the Spirit in our midst. And there is a strong desire to do something, and I have read some things that suggest that strong desire to do something is embedded in a form of white privilege as much as anything, because we've grown up believing that if something needs to be done, well, then we white people can do something. And there's a book I read a number of years ago by Sharon Welch called An Ethics of Something.
I'll look it up.
But in the book, she read a series of novels by African-American authors in which African-American women were the protagonists. And she was looking for, what does it mean to find a sense of agency when society gives you none? And it seems to me that this is a moment, the predicamentness of this, the fact that there are no evident, easy solutions for people with relative privilege. It's easy for us to get paralyzed in that scenario, because all of our lives, if something has needed doing, we've had the capacity to do it. But communities of color have rarely had the capacity to do it. And so they have needed to find more imaginative ways to sustain agency when there seems to be little opportunity to make change on the scale that is necessary. And I think, Michael, that there is something really powerful about saying that in this moment, the community of the Spirit may be akin, it may work in the same way that communities of color have had to work, that it's a matter of listening and attending, and maybe all we do is nudge forward. We don't make big sweeping changes, we nudge forward, because Black women have been nudging forward for generations. And we just finally got one on the Supreme Court. Nudge, 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 generation after generation.
Is it?
Kirsten has chimed in with a feminist ethic of risk.
That's it. Yep.
Sharon Welch, and no shortage of deep thinkers in that arena. But grateful to consider a voice from a different perspective. I think for Prince of Peace, we continue to be burdened, challenged by the systemic, benefit of white privilege as shaping our worldview, and that's a constant that we need to be attentive to as we consider about how to love the world, as we believe we are called to do. And so I'm grateful. I am so glad that we could have you again this evening, David. Your insight, and thank you for bringing your itinerant public theology to us, both this morning and this evening. I suspect there are multiple, thoughts running through everyone's heads, and I imagine we can reach out to you if we have something to follow up with you on, and those kinds of, and we look forward to an opportunity to be in conversation with you again in the future as well, recognizing that you're close at hand, and at least we're grateful for that. Carol, any closing words from you or the Adult Ed Committee this night? You're on mute.
Just again to say thank you, David. It was great, and Margaret too. I'm so glad that you were there to add your voice and to be there at church this morning as well. So, and I'm sure we'll run into each other again and maybe have another round of this at some point. So. And Adult Forum is pretty much wrapping up. Next week is Justin Grimm, and that's a special forum, and that's really the end, right?
For this program year, that's right. Yeah. If you've got ideas for the year ahead, I'm sure you could direct them to Carol or me or any one of our committee. We're grateful for all of the ways in which people have participated over the course of this past year, and look forward to much more wonderful, thought-provoking ways to explore this life of faith together. Grateful for all of you and your presence this evening. Be safe, stay well, and as Garrison Keeler, I think it's keep in touch, right? Yeah. So Anyways, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Pleasant evening, all.